Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Andrew Johnson, and the focus is A Southerner Takes a Stand. The year is 1853, and Johnson is out of political office for the first time in a decade. The elites in Tennessee had gerrymandered his district, which was now dominated by the Whigs. He had no chance of winning re-election, so he decided not to run. But he was hardly done with politics. In fact, he had revenge on his mind. He wanted to go after those elites in the state that kind of cost him his job. So what did he do? He decided to run for the open seat for governor. As before, his biggest challenge was going to be within his own party. The Democratic establishment did not care for Andrew Johnson. He was not from their class. He was a plebeian who had worked his way up. They were not interested in having him as governor, but when the state convention met, Johnson had a lot of popularity with the people. The delegates were for Johnson. They forced his nomination to the top of the list and placed him up against the Whig candidate Gustavus Henry, a wealthy cotton plantation owner, for the governorship. Well, Henry was an easy mark for Andrew Johnson, who was always at his best on the campaign trail, fiery in his rhetoric, and he held his greatest enmity for these plantation owners, the upper class, because he was for the people. Government for all, by all, the American way. He was for primitive Republican simplicity and economy. Within the ancient landmarks laid down by Jefferson and his patriotic associates, this was his political creed, and the message resonated. Andrew Johnson was elected governor of Tennessee in 1853. He was sworn in. He won office by just a couple thousand votes out of 125,000 cast, but he was indeed the new governor. And he had a populist agenda to pursue. The top of the list, public education. He had been denied this as a youth in North Carolina. He didn't have a formal day of education in his entire life, and he wanted to change that for the poor white community in Tennessee. He wanted to expand public schools, and the state legislature complied in this area. Some of the other things he pushed for was more railroad construction. He also wanted to liquidate the Bank of Tennessee, a very sort of democratic perspective. And his legislation effectively came along over time and gave him these victories. Johnson was also pushing for populist policies on a more national scale. He was against the Electoral College. He wanted it eliminated. He thought it was elitist. He also wanted to have the popular election of senators, get the state legislature out of that responsibility and give that power to the people. And he wanted to limit the terms of federal judges to 12 years. Again, give more turnover and more chance for the people to have a say in who would have responsibilities, not just in the legislative, but also the congressional and the judicial side of things. This was the populist agenda, which again was popular throughout the 2 terms of governor for Andrew Johnson, and he also had some challenges. During this time, he had some family challenges. His wife, Eliza. Now, Eliza had been his rock, his supporter, had helped educate him. They were incredibly close, but she became ill. She was diagnosed with what at the time was called slow consumption. We would call it tuberculosis now, and it would afflict her really for the rest of her life. In fact, she would be a semi-invalid the rest of her life, barely able to leave home. But it didn't stop her from being Johnson's biggest fan, biggest supporter. He relied on her. She relied on him, even though it was very difficult for her physically, really, for the rest of her life. They also struggled with a couple of their boys. Charles and Robert were both really struggling with the bottle. Alcoholism would be a bane of their existence, really, for the rest of their lives. For Johnson, his pride and joy was his daughter, Martha, and he was thrilled when she became engaged to one of his friends, Judge David Patterson, there in Greenville, Tennessee, prominent member of the community, and now the husband of his daughter, Martha Johnson. Next logical step for Andrew Johnson as his second term of governor was coming to an end. He was always looking for that next rung on the political ladder. For him, that was to go back to Washington, D.C., the other side of the Capitol, become a United States Senator. And by now, he did have enough support in the state legislature. And sure enough, he was elected to the Senate, age of 49. It's 1857. He's heading back to Washington, D.C. Now, the dominance of the time was all about slavery and expansion. There was turmoil in the country. James Buchanan's the new president of the United States, and he inherited a mess principally located in Kansas, in the frontier territories, where in the previous administration of Franklin Pierce, they had passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened up the Kansas territory to potentially have slavery under the guise of popular sovereignty. This gave the locals, the inhabitants of that territory, the right to choose whether or not to have slavery or not. Basically, what you had is a whole bunch of pro-slavery advocates and anti-slavery advocates all converging into Kansas. It became, in fact, a violent area, fighting for government rights and a lot of violence, almost a mini civil war. This was the focus of the country and certainly was not lost on Andrew Johnson. What did Johnson want to do? Well, one thing he didn't want to do was to repeat what they had tried in 1850 when he had supported the big compromise to try to settle this issue once and for all about slavery expansion. He was tired of compromises. According to Johnson, we have been compromised and conservatized until there was hardly any Constitution left. We first compromise and settle a question wrong, and then we must all turn conservatives and stand by the wrong that has been accomplished by the compromise. Compromise. I almost wish the term was stricken out of the English language. The problem was he didn't have an answer for this problem. The South was adamant that it wanted unrestricted expansion of slavery being available. The North was increasingly against any expansion. Without a compromise or some solution, this was not boding well for the country. Andrew Johnson, though, was much more focused on another piece of legislation, the same piece of legislation that dominated his thoughts when he was a congressman a few years before, and that was his Homestead Act. He had been fighting almost entire tenure as a congressman for this act, which was to give 160 acres of public land to poor white heads of family, to give them a sense of community, ownership, pride, and to be able to uplift them so they could be more productive in the economy. He kept pushing. He reintroduced this bill in the Senate in 1858. He did it again in 1859, advocating to his Senate colleagues. By this bill, you provide a man with a home. You increase the revenue. You increase the consumption of home manufacturers and make him a better man. You give him an interest in the country, and there is no man so reliable as he who is interested in the welfare of his country. And this eventually actually resonated with the Congress. His Homestead Act, after 14 years of trying in the House and Senate, finally passed both houses of Congress. All he needed was the president's signature, which he did not get. His fellow Democrat James Buchanan in the White House vetoed the legislation. He thought it was unconstitutional. And after all this work on this one topic for Andrew Johnson, the issue was effectively dead, with nothing in the end to show for it. Well, it's now 1860 and the country is on edge. It is an election year and party politics was sort of in a jumble. You have the Republicans, a new party that had first run a candidate for president back in 1856, growing stronger in the North. There's a completely regional, sectional party, but getting stronger in the North around the major topic of no more expansion of slavery. In the meantime, the Democrats were fracturing more along sectional lines. You had difference of opinions on this topic of slavery expansion in the North and in the South. And in the end, the Democrats for the first time were unable to rally around a single candidate for president. They held two conventions in 1860. Neither came forward with a single candidate. Multiple candidates were put forward. This split the Democratic vote and eventually helped hand the presidency to the Republicans in the hands of Abraham Lincoln. Well, Andrew Johnson set himself apart during this campaign from just about all of his Senate colleagues because many of them during the campaign were calling for secession from the Union if, in fact, a Republican was elected president. Not Andrew Johnson. For Andrew Johnson, the Union was always foremost in his mind. He said at the time, "I am no disunionist. Because we cannot get our constitutional rights, I do not intend to be one of those who violate the Constitution. I intend to place myself on the Constitution, which I have sworn to support and to stand there and battle for all its greatness." After the election, he stood firm with the Union in the Senate while many of the states started to talk about secession. Well, Johnson gave the most important speech of his career over a two-day period, December 18th and 19th, 1860, a full-throated advocacy to keep the Union intact. He said, on secession, "I am opposed to secession. I believe it is no remedy for the evils complained of. I believe that this battle should be fought not outside but inside of the Union and upon the battlements of the Constitution itself. There is but one way to get out of the Union without the consent of the parties, and that is by revolution." Now, this didn't mean that Andrew Johnson was a supporter of the new president, Abraham Lincoln. He made that very clear. He said, "I voted against him. I spoke against him. I spent my money to defeat him. But still, I love my country. I love the Constitution. I intend to cling to it as the shipwrecked mariner clings to the last plank when the night and the tempest close around him. It is the last hope of human freedom. Now, this speech got a lot of people's attention. It was impactful in the stance that a lot of people noticed. They was decried in the South, he was cheered in the North, but in the end, it had no impact because the South was set on its ways. In fact, the very next day, South Carolina voted to secede, and by the time Lincoln was inaugurated in March, 6 more states would join. When Lincoln decided to re-provision the federal fort in Charleston Harbor, which had been surrounded by the Confederates decided to take action. They bombarded the fort. The Civil War was on. Well, at this point, Southern congressmen were simply leaving in droves out of Washington to go join their colleagues and fight for independence with the South. Well, all except Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was the only senator from a Southern state to stay in Congress at the time. He decided again that this was about the Union, and he was going to fight for the Union from within this government and not join the fight to leave. This immediately elevated his stature in the eyes of a lot of people. Now again, for some this was positive, mostly in the North. For many it was negative, mostly in the South. But I'll tell you, one person who noticed was the incoming president, Abraham Lincoln. But that relationship and that saga is the story for another day. That is Andrew Johnson, and A Southerner Takes a Stand, from the life of Andrew Johnson. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.